Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured, although this might show up in other places as well. I am with Paul Vanderklay and Elizabeth Oldfield. And before I get much further, I want to say that part of the purpose of this conversation is sort of re-announcing the Midwestuary Conference, where both Paul and Elizabeth will be keynote speakers. The Midwestuary Conference is happening August 22nd through 24th in Chicago this summer. And our whole speaker list is Paul Vanderklay, Jonathan Pageau, John Vervaeke, Elizabeth Oldfield, Rod Dreher, and Kale Zelden. You can find more information at midwestuary.com, and you can purchase tickets there. And the theme of the conference is the Fellowship of the Spirit. And we're going to be sort of dabbling our toes in that theme today and trying to, whet people's appetites, lay some groundwork for future productive conversations on that subject today. So in case anyone doesn't know, Paul Vanderklay is the host of the Paul Vanderklay YouTube channel, the lead pastor at Livingstone's CRC, and sort of chief cat wrangler of this little corner of the internet, among other sorts of titles that he may or may not have. Elizabeth Oldfield is the host of the Sacred Podcast and an author and a member of an intentional Christian community in London, England. And so we will be talking today. And I think that the main thing that I wanted to talk about and explore with both of you, and that our conference is sort of sitting right in the middle of, is this sort of new pattern. Although new, I mean, this has been a couple years at this point, although I still think that we're kind of still coming to grips with what's happening and understanding. And if anything, I feel like it's accelerated, not slowed down, of people having new, spiritual growth, spiritual experiences, becoming Christian or becoming some other sort of something. And a lot of this is increasingly mediated through the internet, YouTube, podcasts, things along those lines. But that can often mean that it's happening kind of in relative isolation with you and your earbuds in the gym or while you're doing dishes. And it might not be a shared experience with the people in your life who might have completely different content coming through their earbuds, or who might just not be podcast people. It turns out there are such people, as hard as I find that to believe. And that Christianity is going through all sorts of kind of growing pains and shifts because of this. Denominations are increasingly aware of each other. All of our histories and theological beliefs, for better and for worse, are out there on the internet and being blasted, critiqued, and promoted and defended by apologists from every different angle and critics from every different angle. And it's this sort of weird, new, exciting landscape that a lot of us find ourselves in. And so our conference is sort of, I feel like, trying to, like I maybe sort of said, herd cats in this sort of chaotic, decentralized environment, but also give an in-person place for people going through this to connect with each other, see some of the people that they like to listen to in person, connect with other people who like listening to the same things. It can be really amazing. I've been to these sort of conferences before. You meet someone new, and if your top 4 or 5 favorite podcasts are the same, then all of a sudden you can just, go 1,000 miles an hour with a conversation and get really deep and personal in a way that you sometimes find it hard to do with your neighbors. And so I think that that's sort of the purpose of this conference. And then that's what the conference theme is about, the Fellowship of the Spirit. What is fellowship? What is spirit? What is a spirit? What does this have to do with the Spirit? And all of those sorts of questions. So I don't know, I'll pass it over to you, Paul, first to sort of interact or bounce off of any of the things that I was saying.
Well, I think you're right. And of course, I know Sam's story pretty well. Sam and I go back to a first non-published recording and then a published recording.
If only the audience could hear that unpublished recording, all the juicy details that
what happened?
My audio was terrible. That's the honest answer. Is my internet and audio kept cutting out. That's why it was never published.
But it is so recently I was going to make some comments on Jordan Peterson's conversation with John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall, and I was using obviously the YouTube version of it, and I jump into an ad, which is the Hallow ad, which with sort of a resurgence in the United States of, we call them the tradcaths. So the Hallow app is, you have an app on your phone that's supposed to help your spiritual discipline, and very much comes sort of out of the Roman Catholic, the traditional Catholic vein. And it's not promoting the Pope or a bishop, not even Bishop Barron. This is hosted by Chris Pratt and Mark Walhberg. So two Hollywood stars who are promoting spiritual disciplines. And recently one morning I was just thinking about what I'm always thinking about. And I was just, the word came to me, metagelical, in terms of in the United States and in the UK to a degree, there was this evangelical movement. Of course, that was the movement that Luther and the Europeans and the Reformation called themselves evangelicals. After the Second World War, you had this neo-evangelical movement in the United States, a lot of former fundamentalists who wanted to sort of break out of certain provincial confessional fundamentalisms and have a broader consensus, and that became the evangelical movement, the neo-evangelical movement that eventually was sort of risen to ascendancy with the collapse of the mainline, but also through the press trying to get a name for this group, but they weren't specifically churches. And what we've seen now is this coalition of, you've got Catholics, you've got Orthodox, you've got spiritual but not religious sometimes, you've got people calling themselves Christian atheists. And so there is still sort of a movement around Jesus, and what sort of recedes, and this was clear of evangelicalism and is even happening now with these meta-evangelicals, what recedes is the question of how does the church govern, or what do church structures mean? In fact, the video that I just made yesterday for this morning, I caught in one of our little TLC live streams, a guy who's studying to become an Orthodox deacon noted that he had heard rumors, which are true, that back in January, Pope Francis said, well, this year, Easter for the Orthodox and the Catholics fall on the same day. Maybe the Catholic Church should switch so that we're always on the same day with the Orthodox. And then afterwards, I talked to Father Eric, another guy in the corner. He said, yeah, that happened and almost nobody paid attention to it. And I thought that would be an astounding moment in the history of the church if this would happen. Now, ostensibly because Pope Francis is thinking, wow, we can take a step towards unifying the Catholics and the Orthodox. But I thought all of those issues that are around the authority of the Pope, that's a very old controversy. And then what would all the Protestants do if, in fact, now they've sort of been keeping along with Pope Gregory's, Gregorian calendar sort of mindlessly. And now suddenly, what happens if the remnants of Latin Christendom all decide to switch because the Pope said so? I mean, that is a shift that most people are like, well, I just look at my phone and my Google app.
I thought Google decided when Easter was.
Exactly, because it always moves around during the year and we're never quite sure. But then once you provoke a change like that, provokes people to think about, and suddenly all old issues become new again. And we're living in a time like that where you no longer have the silos and authority structures that sort of organized people. Now, Chris Pratt and Mark Walhberg are our Christian leaders. What does that mean?
Yeah, I'll pass over to you, Elizabeth, for some of your first sort of thoughts and reactions on
Before I do subjects. That, my wonky camera is annoying me, so I'm going to see if I can straighten it up slightly. Many thoughts. Yes, a phrase that keeps coming to me, and it's one that I first came across in Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, is context collapse. And the way human communication is designed for in-person communication, right? Even before we had the technology of writing, we would talk to the people in front of us, and we could read their body language, and they could read our body language, and there was a very specific context. And then as writing takes over, and you are there's more distance between the parties that are communicating with each other, but there's still some sort of bounded context. This is something that's being said in a newspaper. This is something that's being said in a theatre. This is being said in a personal letter to one person. This is being proclaimed at Speaker's Corner through a megaphone. And all those forms of communication are subtly different, and they have different purposes, and they intend to have different effects on us. And the internet just comes and slams a giant I got an image of just a massive breeze block on all of that social infrastructure, and context collapses. And so the ability of a priest or a pastor to say something careful and biblical and pastoral to a small group of people is very different from what you're doing, Paul, which is mass communication. Although I think actually what's lovely about the little corner is it feels like a kind of attempt to almost recreate a familial feeling context in these disembodied forms of communication, which maybe gives me more hope that we're like, okay, no, we can't live with this context collapse. We cannot live with just unmediated information, some of which is profound theological truth, and some of which is absolute nonsense, being pumped at us all day, every day through the same device. We have to learn again how to discern context. And I'm really feeling the way that chaos has some really effects that I find very interesting and life-giving. It has allowed parts of what I think are profound theological truths spin out of their previous context, their container in the church, and end up, in different feeds, in different spaces, like seeds scattered to the wind. And that, I think, is part of what's drawing some unexpected people and some of this spiritual openness. But it's also meant that the structures and the social infrastructures and the communities by which we used to discern what is true and false, what is life-giving and what is unlife-giving, what is humanizing and what is unhumanizing, in my language, what's going to make us more like Jesus and what isn't, have gone. And because I increasingly agree with John Vervaeke that meaning is a communal concept that actually cannot have meaning, I think you probably can't even have truth, in your own head, which is why I hate Descartes. That is a problem for our ability to be. Jonathan Rauch, who's an atheist, but I think has some very interesting things to say about the church and where it sits now, would say to remain a reality-based community. I think, the ground of reality is God. But to remain a reality-based community, we have to keep having these structures that hold us together in collective discernment. And that's what I think is the challenge of this moment.
Yeah, and context collapse, and also a lack of shared and mutually reciprocally known context.
Yeah.
Back when, radio and television were first coming online, there was only a few stations, there was only a few channels. And in many ways, it increased the shared context for people over a larger geographical distance. Whereas previously your shared context would have been more your neighborhood and things that you could know around you. Suddenly now you can have a giant radio station broadcasting the same audio over a giant geographic area, and that brings people into greater sort of shared context in some ways, while also killing a lot of the local particularities along the way. But now, what started as a sort of a unifying force, for better and for worse, has become an individuating force. I feel like, just because there's so many different things. And then the other weird thing is that previously there was no way to really, like if you're listening to the radio or the television, because people lived more densely and because those devices were precious, you often were sharing them with other people, and you could know all these other people listen to the same thing that I did. And if I talk about this at school or at work or whatever it is, there's a decent assumption that I can make that you heard what I heard. And even if you didn't happen to listen to that channel, it won't seem weird if I bring it up.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. But nowadays it's like, and I feel like this is particularly challenging and weird in churches, because I feel like previously, maybe this is still a little bit naive, but in church, most people were spiritually formed and theologically informed by their church and by their church community. And nowadays, a pastor might have, like all of these competing influences that they don't even see what they are, dragging their congregants' attention and spiritual formation and theological ideas in a whole bunch of different directions. And a lot of people can be kind of private about those sorts of things. And so that it becomes, what exactly is the church? And are you more formed by your favorite theological, YouTube channel? Are you more formed by your church? How do you deal with, anyway, all of that complexity? Paul, you look like you have something to say.
Well, I think I really love what you said, Elizabeth, and you, Sam, too, because this context collapse and a lack of a shared story, or at least even a shared experience, I suspect that increases what we're seeing, that reactivity itself then becomes the communal experience.
Wow. Yeah.
Because, I often think about the fact that if you, again, let's think about perhaps you have the collapse of Roman civilization, you have medievalism. Great many people sort of live in what we would call a natural environment where, let's say, the rhythms of nature, the changing of the seasons, the planting and sowing, animal life, all of this sort of becomes a basic phenomenological substrata by which, and then you have, say, the mythic church in the center of the village with the steeple. And so it's very much you can have a nice little monoculture. You have all these monocultures side by side. Of course, you have these great stirring experiences like the Crusades, where suddenly you have massive exchanges, but so much of the population is living in their own little monoculture. And obviously part of what the internet, especially with the collapse of, let's say, the second world, which was the communist world, and globalism from the late 80s into the 90s, and then cable television, the internet, all of what we see again is sort of a rise in reactivity, because all of us can't help but live in our own little monocultures of one, or maybe our family, or maybe our church, or our village, or community, or what have you. But now all of the other monocultures and some much more dominant cultures sort of thrown at us. And at some point, we're going to see something that makes us react. And so then, instead of having sort of these coalitions around belief or practice or shared experience or shared narratives, we now have these massive communities of reaction. Where, it wasn't a surprise to me when I saw sort of the rise of the woke. I thought, if you don't like the woke, wait for the anti-woke, because the anti-woke, that's going to be massive. Because if you're sort of building your monoculture on gender or race or orientation or something like that, fringes have fringes, and the summation of all of those fringes will inevitably be far larger than your little monoculture.
Yeah.
And so, but the difficulty with that, of course, is this reactivity is parasitic. It relies upon a hegemon to push back against. And what we've seen in sort of the weirdness of the last few decades has been people have noted that, for example, in the United States, dominated by, let's say, the boomers, and they're all reacting to the man. The difficulty is that the man the boomers are reacting all sort of passed away in the 70s and 80s, and they're not around anymore. So then you get this conservative reaction to them that says, no, we're reacting against the hippies and the boomers. And
you get Francis Collins is still singing protest songs on the Capitol Mall after he's been removed from his position. Still out there being Woody Guthrie fighting the man with his 6-string guitar. Yeah,
that's right. And I just watched the Bob Dylan movie, a couple nights ago on streaming, and it was like, oh, I'm old enough. I remember. I get this. I get this stuff. I get the feels. And, Pete Seeger, we want to change the world. And
okay, so this is making me think. Forgive me. I don't know what I think until I've externalized it. So this might be incoherent. But the phrase that was coming to mind as you were talking, Paul, was collective outrage has replaced collective effervescence, which is this Emile Durkheim sort of early sociologist understanding of kind of collective spiritual practices in society. It's partly where I get the name of my podcast, The Sacred, from, because he says that societies need to cluster around things they hold sacred. And they do that through these kind of ritualized celebrations and festivals and periods of mourning, of collective effervescence. And I've also been writing and thinking about emotional regulation, partly because I'm trying to be a good mum. And I am realizing that one of the things my kids need when they're like out of control emotions is for me to be grounded, right? I need to hold firm boundaries, but also be kind and compassionate and not problematize the whole concept of anger or the whole concept of sadness, but let them have those. And you cannot hit your brother, right? And I can only do that without getting really angry back if I am emotionally regulated. And I am wondering, so one of the things I'm writing and thinking about is I think my spiritual practices, bear with me here. Part of what I'm doing in prayer is I'm bringing my unregulated self into the presence of very steady, very grounded, very regulated love. And then I can get myself steadied and I can go back out and be a safe and steady presence for my kids. But that actually, there's a very, to go back to Durkheim, I think what his work says is we really like feeling things together. We feel most fully human when we feel things together. And there's a bit in Oliver Burkeman's book about all the studies around this, our heart rate sync up, and then there's a dopamine release. It makes us feel good when we feel things with other people. We feel less alone because we're interconnected. And healthy spiritual practice, when churches are working, they are forms of collective emotional processing. We go and we feel sad and we lament, and then we go and we celebrate. And we find our steadiness again. And then we can go back out into the world and be steady people. But we don't have that now. And I'm wondering if what's happening in the collective outrage is we want to feel anything with anyone. And if anger's all there is, we will do it. But that helps no one self-regulate, and therefore no one come to a kind of more healthy emotional and spiritual life.
Yeah. And I think that really is part of the draw for conferences like the ones that we're hosting. I still remember that feeling in say early 2016 when Jordan Peterson was doing his biblical series. And I'm looking at these videos. I'm like, this has 1 million views. Where are the 1 million people? That's bigger than the largest football stadium I've ever been in. But is it you? I want to stand up in my giant cubicle office space and be like, surely if there's 1 million people, at least one of them, there's at least one other person in here that's hearing what I'm hearing. But how do I have that feeling of, collective interest and excitement of what I'm listening to? And I think that is a lot of what this little corner is sort of, I feel like we are trampling down social media with social media. Right, we are fighting YouTube with YouTube, fighting the internet with the internet, and using
the judo guys.
Right, we're using the powers of darkness against itself, We will not be isolated. We will not be turned into consumers. We will have our interpersonal community, and we will make the content that for ourselves and each other that we would like to listen to. And we know the person behind the channel, and they know us, and we leave a comment in the comment section. It's not just some angry screed. It's hopefully they recognize and remember our name. But that doesn't mean that it always works. It's not.
I mean, the difference between the comments under Paul's videos and the comments on some of the videos I've been in are very different.
Yeah. And,
also, I'm going to eat some nuts. I hope you don't mind.
Go for it. And it's because if you are showing up in the same place repeatedly, a reiterated interaction is much more likely to go better than a one-off anonymous interaction. And if I say something mean to Paul or in response to one of the other people in Paul's comment sections, well, I might see them again, quote unquote, in the next video or the video after that, or they might show up in my comment section or whatever. And that helps bring something more like a healthy social environment where you feel accountable and you want to, be friendly, make good impressions, critique lightly and gently as low as possible and stuff like that. But what exactly unites it is then a bigger and unclear question. And what exactly is the uniting? Like, it does feel like, this little corner and other parts of the internet have like a spirit to them in the way that Paul will talk about school spirit. And that's sort of what I mean. Like, when we show up in person, it feels like we can go deeper, faster, even if I've never met you or if I've just seen your screen name underneath the video before. And because we have all of the shared context and shared sort of spirit, whereas I might not share that spirit with other people. But what's sort of generating that spirit? What is that spirit? How is it managed? How is it kept healthy? How is it kept oriented towards the Holy Spirit? What exactly is the Holy Spirit? We sort of say, I mean, thinking of the Holy Spirit as the thing that sort of collectively unites Christendom, I think is a fair thing to say. But even then, Christendom, that's a complicated word to use, right? Maybe not Christianity. Those who follow Jesus, I don't know, whichever one of those words. I'm trying to mean them synonymously, but I know that they're different. Anyway, those are the thoughts that are swirling in my head.
What do you think, Paul? What's holding it together?
He's scared the answer is himself, and he's trying to find an answer that isn't just himself.
It's funny because, and I think you'll agree with this, Elizabeth, I think hospitality is a key element of this.
Yeah.
And part of what hospitality is, let's say, the person who owns the home extending themselves to the guest. And obviously hospitality is a deep biblical theme. There was a book in the late 90s, early aughts going around in Christian circles and my Christian circles about hospitality, sort of trying to bring that more to the fore for people to think about. And whereas YouTube seemed to have primarily been used to police your tribal boundaries and try to expand your tribal boundaries through rational apologetics and things like this, even between Christian groups. I think what changed and sort of part of the culture and the spirit that built up in the corner was I sort of found myself on YouTube accidentally. And then people began talking to me, and I just did what a pastor does. And contrary to what most people think, I think most pastoring is listening rather than admonishing or advising or lecturing. That doesn't mean that pastors don't admonish, advise, or lecture from time to time too. But the fact that most of what I did on my channel, which does continue to be controversial because people, when they hear someone on the internet saying something that they think is wrong, they very much want to see that person be corrected in real time, if not owned. The question of hospitality, I really love what you said, Elizabeth. I think you're really right that churches within their walls often are able to create this collective effervescence. And then part of what happens with music, especially once technology is allowed to create mass music. Of course, first it's through written music, and then the player piano, and then eventually sound recording, radio, and then with television we add images, and then we've just added on from that, is a music concert. Somebody out there's, we have a bunch of musicologists in the corner who are going to have to work on this, but music concerts are in some ways, I think, downstream from religious events. And now that we've been able to reproduce music, and that often comes up in conversation, that where do people sing together? Well, religious people say, I sing all the time.
At the Taylor Swift Eras concert, Paul, that's where people sing together, and I'm not joking.
No,
right?
I know.
And Taylor Swift is able to balance this sort of individualized thing through the internet, but then bring people together in giant stadiums where everyone's singing along and singing together. And for many people, that's one of the most exciting, memorable, and effervescent experiences that they have that year, and they're willing to fork over the money that demonstrates that they feel that way. And Taylor Swift is still one of those things that you can talk about and assume that everyone else knows what you're talking about,
except me.
Who's Taylor Swift dating, Paul?
Until a few months ago, I couldn't name a single one of her songs. But that point though is key, because then you have the moment when the music stops, or you walk out of the movie theater, or you walk out of your church, and then at least the church has told people, okay, now you have to go out and you have to live this feeling. Mm-hmm. It's like, how do I live a feeling? What does that mean for my neighbor? And what feeling is it? Is it anger? I have to, destroy their shop. I have to make a sign. So I think we're, and I love how you said it, Elizabeth, because there's the scale. It's individual, it's my family, it's all of those ranges of Dunbar numbers, and then they just get exploded, and then it's just the collective.
So one of my questions for you is, I think a lot about Jonathan Haidt in The Anxious Generation wrote about communities morally, I don't think he used this phrase, I think it's a Luke Brotherton phrase, but morally formative communities, which is one of the things that I think we are desperately in need of as society. We actually do want to grow in character and virtue. Not every political persuasion will use that language, but I think everyone wants to move towards the good, in some way. Although we might pivot ourselves, and maybe that's not true. The majority of people want to grow. They want to grow up their souls. They want to have a meaningful life. And the way we have always done that is in communities, right? We have had to negotiate. We have seen the way our behavior affects other people, and then we have had to rupture and repair. And almost all communities across history Haidt talks about high barriers to entry and high barriers to exit. And if you live in a local neighborhood with someone, there's no high barrier to entry, and effectively you're born into it. But you have to rupture and repair, because otherwise you have to see the person that you're angry with every day. And that's also true of church communities. It used to be true of unions, right? These places, and he says it's particularly key for teenagers and for brain development as teenagers to be part of communities where you learn your impact on the world and you moderate your behavior, because you come to see other human beings as fully human, which young children, I think, there's a developmental thing. And what happens when the only communities you're part of are on the internet, which are low barrier to entry and low barrier to exit, and if something goes wrong, you can't just leave. Anyone can join, but anyone can leave at any time. No one's going to notice. No one's going to come around your house and say, are you okay? Is that it's very hard to do the work of character formation, and that they are not morally formative. My guess is that you would say something maybe slightly different about what's like. Okay, so my question is to you, given that it is necessarily, I assume, low barrier to entry and low barrier to exit, Do you think that this little corner of the internet can be or is a morally formative community?
I know that many people have had that experience with it. I just recently, somebody who is a major, actually, he's got a fairly low profile, but he's actually a very determined player in this little play space. Talked about the fact
This makes him sound like an evil villain behind the scenes.
I don't know. Phlebas, are you an evil villain? But he talked about the fact that he grew up in the same denomination I did. His brother is a family of 6 kids. His brother left the Christian Reformed Church and became a Hare Krishna. And he noted that nobody in his family for a long time knew how to talk to him. Because they were family, they wanted to have a conversation with him, but they just couldn't figure out how to do that. And anybody who's had relationships knows that these things happen. They can happen, in selective areas, like say, I can't talk with this person about that thing. Okay. But it's so raptured. And he made the comment recently on one of our little live streams that happens all over the place, very small audiences, that he says, because of my involvement in this little community, I was able to talk to my brother again. And I don't know if I heard anything that quite moved me so much than to hear that.
Yeah.
And I didn't set out trying to do that. But I think a lot of this is we're trying to model for each other how we can talk about differences. And of course, there are no differences in many ways as great as religious differences, because religion is sort of the bottom layer of the stack. And, sort of what has, just thinking about Sam's story. I mean, when Sam first found me, he wanted to talk about the fact that he's a biblical Unitarian, and he can't seem to talk about the Trinity with Trinitarians because they want to wall him out because they don't know how to talk to him about that, especially because he knows all this stuff about church fathers and things, and they don't know much about that. They just came on with the Trinity tribe. So somehow it's happening. And I praise God for that. But I haven't, and this is a frustration for some people, because a lot of people for a long time say, Paul, would you just please tell us the system that you're working here? So I don't know what the system is.
So I can be comfortable with it. If you show me the operating manual, then I can understand what's going on and I won't be so worried.
Right.
And if I don't know the operating manual, then can I trust this thing? I think that's what a lot of people are feeling. But to answer your question, Elizabeth, one thing that's interesting about this little corner is, like, I looking at my YouTube metrics, and I suspect yours are similar, Paul, my most common demographic is in their 30s. And I have more people in their 40s than in their 20s. And I don't have a ton of teenagers. And so at some level, I feel like a lot of the moral formation that you're talking about, Elizabeth, happens at a younger age than the core. We're sort of assuming, we're hoping that you were raised well out there by the time that you get to us. And we're counting on a lot of people having already morally formed people before they get to this corner of the internet. And I feel like this is something like it appeals to a lot of people who are, I think it's common, especially when you become married or a parent, that you start taking more intentional looks at your own spiritual life and your own spiritual formation. And that a lot of times people's 20s are a little bit more carefree and they might not think about those things. And then sort of that next life stage kicks in and it brings it back up the hierarchy of importance. And that this community appeals to a lot of people in that stage, but I certainly wouldn't want to exclude any 20-year-olds or teenagers or whatever. And also, I should also say, we have a lot of people way older than their 40s too. My meetup group in person has people into their 80s. And I think if we were to do the median age of my meetup, it might be late 40s or something like that. And so I feel like, are we a moral formation community? I feel like in some sense, not yet. But in many ways, we're shaping the people who are forming young kids or their families and stuff like that, and helping them do that well in this sort of new and weird age.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the difference, honestly, between Christian YouTube and this little corner of the internet is just the age of the main audience. I think a lot of the people who watch the more apologetics, my propositions are right and yours are wrong, my propositions are right and yours are wrong, and I'm going to show you with facts and logic. I bet that their average age is a lot more teenagers and early 20s, and ours is a lot more later than that. And that's it's partly a difference of temperament, but it's, I think, probably even more so a difference of age and maturity and interest based off of that.
Yeah. Everyone's black and white when they're a teenager, right? And then
Yeah.
that gets harder to sustain.
Yeah.
I remember Jordan Peterson talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and talking about it isn't really observing violence or malice or chaos or destruction. It really hits when you discover that you've been the author of that trauma. You've been the author of that destruction. Because on one hand, if someone else is the baddie, that's just an easy psychological thing for us to outsource the evil to everyone else. And I think it's when people get into then they've gone into a romantic relationship or a parenting relationship, and they've thought, well, I'm the goodie, I'll do everything right, it'll be great. And then they discover, oh no, you've not only been hurt, you've done the hurting. Now, either you can just double down on the reactivity and the, blaming, or you can stop and say, holy crap.
Yeah.
What if I'm the problem?
Yeah.
And so having Chad in the corner as really a pillar in this community, and we have a lot of people in our community who are in recovery programs of one kind or another, because at that point, okay, so AA really helped me stop alcohol, but the alcoholism was actually a symptom of a much bigger malady that just not drinking doesn't really resolve.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the recovery movement is the sort of epitome of a morally formative community, but anyone can join, right? And you can just stop going. And yet it's norms and its rituals and its rhythms and its postures are so thick that they are very transformative. And I wonder if, I think I do a lot of kind of hosting and facilitation and group chairing, and more we have a sort of slightly jokey icon of Brene Brown up in our house. My husband bought it for my 40th birthday because we kept joking about being the Order of Saint Brene in our community house. And I was like, oh, that's so funny and beautiful and also maybe offensive. I'm not sure what to do with it. But she says clarity is kindness. And I think if we are sufficiently modeling norms and naming norms and then inviting people in, and so certainly I'm finding on the sacred or in my writing on my Substack or in public events, knowing that I can be fully myself in my particularity as long as I very strongly signal I don't hate you to the people who disagree with me. Like, I'm more and more thinking, like, if we do one thing in the world, signaling I don't hate you is just deeply transformative, because everyone's scanning, and particularly now I think it's very reactive, scanning for someone who will hate us, who will just be a bit contemptuous. That's what I'm coming to the conclusion. That's what the like rainbow lanyards are doing. That they are a way of saying I don't hate you, which they're complex, right? Culturally complex. But that hospitality is both saying you are welcome here, and I am glad you are here, and I'm going to show you how we're going to be here, right? Like when people come to dinner at our community house, lots of people come, all different perspectives, all different beliefs, and we start with silence to give thanks for this food, and then we say, if you would like to come pray with us in the chapel afterwards, you're so welcome. They're very strong norms, and we say, you don't have to participate in any of that if you like, and we're delighted that you're here. And I think that combination of, I think of it as deep roots and wide branches, like real steadiness in who we are, non-defensive, non-defended, and a deliberate, I did it the other day, I was writing a piece about gender. She's always very, very, takes care and caution, and was trying to avoid the landmines, but also be honest that, like, I think men and women, these are still useful categories, even if they need complexifying. But all I said was, I know there are some readers who identify as non-binary, and I'm glad you're here. And you don't have to say, and I hold all the same positions on gender as you do.
Or even I affirm whatever choices you're making, but I'm glad
and that's what
here.
the culture says. Like, in order to hear I don't hate you, we have to hear I fully agree with everything you think.
Yeah.
That's not true. You can just say, I'm glad you're here. Like, I see you. I noticed that you're here. And I'm really glad you're here. And also this is what I'm thinking about right now. And I think that's probably part of what's going on in this little corner is you actually have some quite strong norms. And then people feel safe because you have strong norms. But then you're also saying, yeah, you're a Unitarian and you don't know what you think, and you're a Muslim and you're just seeking. And let's listen to each other because maybe we have things to learn from each other.
Yeah.
The corner is weird though, because we grew out of this reaction to kind of therapy speak. We grew out of this reaction to this sort of everyone is welcome, everyone is fine. And it was really funny when a particular American corporation asked if they could license the estuary protocol to use in their DEI program. I just thought, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah.
And so part of it is
it's so ironic at like
I know,
level,
I mean, it's so deeply ironic. This sort of grew out of this reactivity to a certain therapy speak, and Jordan Peterson kind of saying, no, I won't use your pronoun.
Who himself is a therapist, right?
Who himself is a therapist. I mean, and that's where I see this as sort of so many of these easy rituals or let's say boilerplate speech acts have sort of been gamed. And so what we sort of have to do again is act out in a way that I really don't know. I really don't know how this is all happening. I still don't know how this is all happening. And I still don't know where it all goes. But as long as it seems...
You're a human being.
Well, like, here's a particularly pointed and interesting question. Like, we can't do communion really at these conferences because that brings up a whole host of problems. And like, even if we are, it's at a CRC church, right? And even if Paul or the local CRC pastor says that we're going to have a time of communion,
Can I just clarify, what does CRC stand for?
Christian Reformed Church. Yeah, the Dutch Calvinist denomination that Paul is a part of. And so, I mean, you guys, is CRC even open table? Do you guys have? No, you're not open table.
Not so you supposed to be.
You're not supposed to be. I bet practice a lot of. Yeah. All right. So you're kind of not, but kind of are open table. And you have your own rules, or should be rules. And then there's Catholics and Orthodox and other sorts of people who are told that they are not supposed to take communion at other people's churches, even though many of them in practice might do that, even if their priest thinks that they shouldn't. And so then it's like this whole weird interlapping web of all of Christians' distinctiveness and boundaries of particularity get all brought up. Okay, so that's like too much of a messy thing to do to try and take communion. Not to mention the fact that we are happy to be a welcoming community for non-Christians. Like John Vervaeke is one of our headline speakers, and that's very much on purpose and not an accident or just like a token sort of thing, right? And okay, but can we say the Lord's Prayer at these events? Chad is writing a song that's sort of like the theme song for the event. It's actually really good. It's on his YouTube channel if you want to check it out. But it goes into the Lord's Prayer, and it does the whole Lord's Prayer with the melody of the chorus in it at the end. So I'm like, how's everybody going to feel about the Lord's Prayer? I mean, obviously there are, are we going to say sins, trespasses, or debts? But there are deeper questions than just that. if we're singing these songs as a lyric and a song, is that all praying together? And I think that these sorts of things are real questions, and it sort of circles back around, Paul, to what you were talking about Easter dating, and who is in this weird world of like hyper pluralism and sort of a need to get along with each other in ways. I mean, Christianity's been dealing with Christian pluralism for a while, but it's like the gas pedal is even further down now than it has been in the past on a lot of those sorts of questions. And so if the Pope changes the date of Easter to correspond with the Orthodox, well, back in the Middle Ages, the Pope wasn't supposed to change the date of Easter. The Orthodox were supposed to get on board with the Bishop of Rome and change their date to match his date, right? That would be a lion culture Pope, right? The fox culture Pope is, all right, even if the Orthodox aren't wanting me to, I'm going to realign my church to be with their date. And it's sort of like we've been brought into communion on that particular aspect, even if they didn't want to be, right? And that's sort of a foxy kind of move to do on that sort of thing. But Protestants who have basically never had to deal with the subject of the date of Easter, well, do we follow the Pope? We don't follow the Pope. That's kind of what being a Protestant is. But we've just inherited this Easter dating system from them.
And how important is it that it's celebrated on a certain day? And is there such a thing as the Sabbath? And isn't every day like every other day in the new...
Right. And should we just go back to the 14th of Nisan and line up with the Jews again? Right. You know, like, I don't know, like, right. Like all of these sorts of questions are, I feel like, somehow interrelated and connected to this whole metagelical moment.
It was when I started Estuary, it was really hard for me because we don't open with prayer and we don't close with prayer. And when I started doing it on Sunday morning, so we have people who don't stay for the 11 o'clock worship service, never have. And we have other people who they really like it on Sunday morning because they can just come early and have Estuary and then have church. And so then when we have an Estuary leadership team now who's trying to help, keep all of the Estuary groups kind of on one thing, whatever that thing is, they start opening with prayer. And John Van Donk is like, should we open with prayer?
So I think I would obviously share this conversation, and a lot of people who know me will not know what estuary is. Sure. So it might be helpful for you to say what that is. And I honestly, my understanding of it was that it was much less explicitly Christian than it's sounding. And it sounds like there's some figuring out. I didn't think it was a Christian movement. I thought it was a movement with lots of Christians in it, in which people could come and talk out about deep things.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
You're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's an estuary protocol that Sam refuses to implement in the Chicago group now that they're having an estuary conference. And
it's a splinter. It's a schism.
We predate the estuary protocol. Anyway, I'll let Paul go.
The protocol has
He's having his date of Easter, and you can't have his date of Easter.
You introduce yourself. You pitch a topic for the table, or you just say what you've been thinking about for the last week.
Yeah.
You point to someone else's topic and you talk about it. That's it.
Right.
And this really confuses Christians and non-Christians when I do it in church on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
So
it is what I thought it was. Okay. It's keep listening to people across difference. It just happens that there's loads of Christians in it.
It just I mean, so the Chicago schism, we started so Paul started as a Jordan Peterson meetup, which was for people who wanted to talk about Jordan Peterson related subjects who didn't have a place to do that. And then that slowly kind of evolved through some iterations into the estuary movement. I founded what, as far as I'm aware, was the second Jordan Peterson meetup, which was in Chicago, relatively close after Paul started his in Sacramento.
Right.
And then we had the question, and then Jordan Peterson basically was like inactive, right, for a couple of years. So that's part of the evolution of the whole thing. And then so we were like, so are we an estuary group or are we not? Are we just still what we've been this whole time? And then like the estuary protocol is really helpful for if there's new people to the group or new people coming together. But for our group that has mostly, it's like 90% repeat customers, it can feel a little tedious or almost a little even sort of forced and awkward to do the full thing. And it's like, guys, can't we just get to talking? But we still go around and do we just do one round where you introduce yourself and say a little bit about yourself and what you might be interested in talking about that night. And then we just go, right? We don't do the second or third round of spotlighting or voting or that sort of thing. So we have a slightly different liturgy than the California diocese does. The Illinois one is still slightly irregular.
Sacramento, otherwise known as Rome. Thank you very much.
I don't know. I mean, Chicago's the center of the country. We're a little bit bigger than Sacramento. We don't feel the need to be dragged around quite that way.
I leave you two to this.
But you're right, Elizabeth, that it's about like 80 or 90% Christian. But we have one of our most regular member is Buddhist. And we have some people who are definitely not Christian, and then we have people who are sort of like cultural Christians in the way that, say, a Douglas Murray might, kind of agree with. And we have a full spectrum that way. And we are certainly not religiously exclusive, but just by the nature of the thing, we attract a lot of Christians.
Well, that's how social networks work, right?
Yeah.
You're looking for people we feel at home with. Yeah.
But we are not connected to a church is also another difference of us. We meet in a library, and I still have worries of being too closely connected to a church because I have a repeat history of getting kicked out of churches, and so I have slight feelings of trepidation of being underneath a Trinitarian church authority because it hasn't gone well for me in the past. But
when I listen to our non-Christians in our group, I ask, why do they come every week? So you have these people meeting weekly in a church building. And part of the reason why I started it was I'd have people knocking on my door because they needed money for gas or for rent or some of these things. But I would really love to have a conversation with them. And nobody wanted to talk to a pastor. And so I needed to have something where being a pastor was no longer a negative because they presumed something about me, which wasn't true, and try and shift the people into a position where, I get to have my say. Paul will listen to me. Paul will respect me. And I wanted this as a pastor because I saw through years of church Bible studies that people in church would basically lie to their other church members to stay in conformity to the collective beliefs. And I found that as a pastor to be unproductive. I don't care if you can accurately predict what you think I want to hear. I want to hear what you really think so that we can talk about it. Otherwise, and so I saw this not just as something that was doing a service to the broader community, like hosting an AA group, but I also saw it as something needed by the church because people in church have doubts or contrary beliefs, and they stifle them for very good reasons because they don't want to lose status and say something like, do you really think Jesus is the Son of God? Whereas that's a conversation that should happen in the church.
Yeah.
But it should be a real conversation. And I think, again, going all the way back to where we started this about context collapse. I love a lot of the work that John Vervaake's done. Your conversation with John at Unheard, it happened like 2 days after I left the UK. I was so bummed when I heard that because some of the people at my event were going to your events like, I want to go. But
it really was a great conversation.
It was a great conversation because unlike sort of this paradigm that we've had about our beliefs, we sort of assume that our beliefs are sort of built up from a foundation, let's say the Bible, or if there's a secret sacred self, somehow this internal intuitive thing discovers the truth by virtue of, I don't know what. Our beliefs are situated in contexts. And all these Christian confessional beliefs have contextual histories and are having contextual conversations. Because, one of the things that someday I will have a conversation with Sam, maybe a series of conversations with Sam on his biblical Unitarianness and on his questions about the divinity of Christ. I think that conversation actually has a lot more to do with what I think the major current conversation is, which is, what do we mean by God?
Yeah.
And
I agree with that.
Are you still there audibly, Elizabeth?
I'm still there. It looks like for some reason my camera.
Oh, you're back. You're back.
Okay.
And so, Elizabeth, when you begin, I was so interested when I first found your stuff, because you begin with the sacred. And of course, when I was watching that Bob Dylan movie and I'm thinking, this is sacrality to the generation that I grew up in. Bob Dylan is sacred.
Well, they called him a prophet even back during his early phases, right? That was noted. I think one other aspect of this, and this is connecting to some things that you were saying earlier, Elizabeth, is that I feel like we're having an increasingly hard time getting along well with people with whom we disagree. And I think you can see that in a lot of, like, I don't know, one example that's coming to mind is like gender polarization with respect to politics, and that causing problems with dating and coupling and marriage. As men and women on average have increasingly different political views. And it's not just that they have different political views, but that one side or the other feels like they need someone who agrees with them on politics.
Like, just gonna switch to my webcam. Yeah, it won't be as nice quality, but
like me and my wife watch Love is Blind, which is, I highly recommend, as high quality grade A reality dating television.
It's terrible but very addictive.
But there's often very interesting things that happen. It has its redeeming moments.
Yeah, the first bit's really good when they're actually can't see each other, then it goes down.
Yes. But in like the most recent season in Minnesota, there were multiple couples that their relationship fell apart just mostly due to political difference.
Yeah.
And that in both cases, it was mostly the girl who just wanted the guy, didn't like the guy's conservatism, and the guys, the guys are bashful to say what they really think on camera and to a mostly liberal audience, and the girls are sort of hounding them on that, and then it causes sort of the the end of the relationship. And like, that is why I kind of like the show. It's like, it helps me understand what people are talking about out there in the real world. That's a whole question. Maybe that wasn't the right phrase. But I do think that part of what this little corner in the estuary movement is seeking to do is, how can we be a place that both simultaneously takes important questions seriously, and it's not just a kumbaya ecumenicalism that sort of just downplays the importance of any real deep questions, but how can we be a place that also is welcoming to different beliefs, and that, Sam doesn't get excommunicated, and that how do we hold those things in tension and in balance, and even work them together for a productive way of learning from people with whom you disagree.
So I think this loops back again to the beginning and about emotional regulation, right? That there is, I don't know that you do this without healthy spiritual practices. And that is what, when you're not in a regular embodied community, is hard to do. Like, I think that a healthy spiritual life involves individual practices, contemplative practices, spiritual disciplines, all these things the Halo app will help you with. And then it involves this really hard thing, which is being up close with other people, not like yourself, on the regular, and letting them be annoying, and letting you be annoying to them, and learning to tolerate. I mean, it's the reason I'm still in local congregations. It's also because I have a theological commitment to the local church as the bride of Christ. But honestly, I'm not sure that intellectual position would be enough if I didn't have the sense of, like, it would be bad for my soul not to keep putting myself in spaces with people from very different socioeconomic backgrounds, very different cultural backgrounds, very different political backgrounds, very different international backgrounds. And speaking sort of explicitly from my Christian tradition, I think this is the bit, I write about it in my book, Fully Alive, in a chapter on wrath. Like, I think it is one of the most like gleaming jewels of Christian wisdom that we have undervalued and undertaught, which is that the New Testament can be read as a guidebook on how to be someone who can tolerate difference and disagreement in a loving community. That is what Jesus is repeatedly doing. He is walking into a scene, winking to camera, and then going to the most outcast person in the scene who is making everyone else feel tense. And this understanding that you see of both how tribalism works, how homophily, people like me syndrome works, this deep-seated tendency to feel uncomfortable around difference and disagreement, and how actually the practices of turning the other cheek, praying for those who persecute you, loving your neighbors, like seeking to build radical community with Greeks and Jews and men and women and slaves and Roman centurions, right? The weirdness of the early Christian community and its cross-cutting of what felt like unbridgeable tribal divides in the ancient world means that there is a very strong toolkit there for how we become the kind of people who can be in a dating relationship and realize that someone holds different political views from us and go, that's really interesting. Help me understand how you came to those conclusions, not you terrible wokester or you terrible fascist, and run a million miles. But that is not the formation that we're getting from wider culture. And it's why I'm really keen to actually go back to the Gospels and look at what Jesus is trying to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
I also, a couple points to that. One is the reason Jesus just continues to bother us and fascinate us is, again, he is more demanding than we think is reasonable, and he is more accepting than we think is responsible, and he's both of these things at the same time. One of the things that I see in, let's say, the walking away from church into Buddhism is that what you just described is also in some ways marketed by Buddhism, Eastern spirituality, in that I see a lot of people getting out of Christianity and getting into a yoga studio or getting into a meditation center for exactly that reason, because their spouse or their parents or the politics is annoying them. And so what they've learned is that through meditation, through yogic practice, they can regulate themselves internally. And a bunch of these people tell me, and I'm not going to tell them that they're wrong, a bunch of these people tell me that they spent forever in church, and church didn't help them at all with their emotional regulation. But when they finally got into yoga or into Buddhism and they learned how to meditate and they practiced mindfulness, that helped with their meditation. And so, I'm not going to enter into a debate in terms of which religious which has better truth in marketing, Christians versus Buddhists, and talking about emotional self-regulation. I think the crazy thing about Jesus is the same Jesus who in the house of the Pharisees allows this sinful woman to wash his feet is the same Jesus who has the Sermon on the Mount, which there's this wonderful situation in the 80s when a woman tied to my denomination, she was an English lit professor at Texas A&M, completely without any context, passed out the Sermon on the Mount to her Bible Belt university students to ask them, write a response paper to this. Many of them didn't recognize it. And then most of them hated it because they said, I don't know who this guy thinks he is, but like, looking at a woman with lust in your heart is somehow connected with adultery? Give me a break. And it wasn't just the men who said this. So it's this, and so I think that's part of what we're wrestling with in terms of the church, and I think, I mean, the Protestant Reformation tries to rationally define the church in terms of confessionalisms in reaction to, I think, medieval Catholicism and Orthodoxy to a degree, trying to define the church in terms of proceduralisms. And there is, in fact, a spirit of Christ that at the same time, as I said, is so demanding we think it's irresponsible and unreasonable, but also so open we think it's irresponsible. Because if you let those sinners and tax collectors continue to get away with the sex trafficking and the tax farming that they're doing at the behest of imperial Rome, Jesus, how can you be soft on Rome? And if you don't get in line with our stand against imperialism, we're going to shut you up by having the Romans kill you.
Yeah.
And, it's that Jesus story just...
Yeah. It's very complex. And this is the way I talk about it in the book. Another way to talk about emotional self-regulation is repentance, right? Like, I think when I am triggered into not just anger, because anger can be righteous, as we see in Jesus, but contempt for someone because they disagree with me or they have a different tribal signifier to me, I am sinning. And I need to turn towards the person made in the image of God and say sorry. And I don't think all of this, like that actually, I think all of the using those different languages is helpful because it helps us see things in the round. But yes, I think tribalism is sin. I think that sexual immorality, where we treat other people like an object for our own ends, is sin. And that it's only in these morally formative communities, and it is only in receipt of grace, it's only in receipt of the possibility that we are able to change, right? That we can turn, and we will be welcomed if we turn, not banished and exiled forever, that we can change. I want to say something a bit vulnerable, but because you brought up the male-female thing, Sam, on the dating, I think that is one of the things. And what's interesting about the data is that men have become slightly more conservative, and young women have become much more progressive. And that is interesting to me, because I wouldn't have guessed that without looking at the data. And I think part of what's going on there is fear. So part of what's going on there is just like, on average population level tendency of women to be very concerned about harm and have a easier compassion response, which means that a lot of the progressive politics around the protection of the vulnerable, of which there is a very beautiful heart to, is a natural kind of appeal that comes out of a care instinct. But it's also because any slight move to the right by the male population, even if it is like beautiful and thoughtful and about a return to responsibility and about a return to connection in the family and all of the things that are beautiful about that, can't help but smell like we're being sent back to the kitchen. Like we're being sent back to centuries and centuries of being treated as lesser and our bodies being seen as available to whoever wants them, or somehow just like terrible, tempting objects in the world to lead all the men astray. And as for me as a woman, showing up again and again in quite heavily male spaces, of which midwestry will be one, looking at this, like this, just in the speaker lineup, part of my like repentance and soul work and emotional self-regulation is noticing when that's happening in me and noticing when I'm responding to something that is actually not a threat, as if it's a threat, because of all this semi-conscious background stuff of women just bodily having more of an inheritance of just feeling physically unsafe in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for saying that, Elizabeth. I also really liked, Elizabeth, your conversation recently with Shane Claiborne. I thought that he is, I don't know, he's somewhat TLC adjacent, but is probably somewhat dismissed now as being left coded. I remember I had a really big Shane Claiborne phase in college, back when his like books were first coming out, and it seemed like, the cool millennial college kid Christian thing to do. And I still feel like there was a lot good in that. And that I think that a lot of the sort of, I don't know, current resurgence of Christianity is very right coded, right? And Justin Brierly is exploring that a lot, especially in his most recent episodes. And I think he's absolutely right to do so, that it is connected with sort of a somewhat right-wing sense of, I don't know, national identity and those sorts of things. And that there isn't as much emphasis that I see on those more compassionate elements of the Christian story and the Christian message and the character and model of Jesus. And I think that one thing that does need to happen is that this sort of right-coded thing needs to not be just scared of those things because they sound left or something like that. Or, oh, as soon as we bring up compassion, you're going to try and exploit my compassion for, undermining me or something like that. And there's this distrust that's been built up over the last 5 or 10 years for political, social reasons of those sorts of things. And I do feel like that needs to be reintegrated. And your conversation with Shane Claiborne sort of reminded me of that. And I hadn't heard a voice like his in a while.
Yeah, he is very refreshing in that he's still saying everything he was saying, right, 20 years ago. And he's still like, let's go to the scriptures. Like, let's read the Bible. Let's see what we can find here. And his book is really, he's very much like, I oppose abortion. I just oppose a bunch of other stuff too. Like I kind of, the narrative script I have in my head is that people always slide on a certain trajectory and end up kind of so far out of the kind of historic creeds of the church that there's nothing left. And I don't see that in him at all. I see someone very, very rooted in the Gospels in a way that is very refreshing to me.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Paul.
I want to continue on with because with the man woman thing, because what's interesting to me is that I think I would really love right and left talk to just go away, because I think they're hopelessly scrambled at this point.
Yeah.
And we're looking sort of for other we're looking sort of for other poles through which to use to sort of do the analysis and discernment with respect to some of what we clearly see emerging. And part of the question that you noted was, well, there's obviously a historical narrative, and there are questions of trust or mistrust in authority. There are questions of safety. And I mean, part of what's, one of the more interesting voices to come along, I think, has been Mary Harrington and Louise Perry, who have really scrambled this scene, because both ostensibly feminists, then sort of taking on, a bunch of issues that they say, actually the liberation that was heralded in the movement back in the 70s and 80s, and then that's continued on, has actually benefited the the perpetrators and the people who would in fact like to reduce women to their bodies or their labor. So I'm really curious what you see in that right now, because again, part of the weirdness of what has happened around us and is going to be manifest in this conference is it's definitely down. A lot of people, not everyone, as they will remind you, are definitely downstream of sort of what Jordan Peterson broke open. But many of the women that even came to my Jordan Peterson meetups who were most passionate were moms.
Yeah.
Because they saw how their sons were being treated in the San Francisco Bay Area. One woman was a lawyer. She came in hot because she said, I went to San Francisco expecting love and openness and welcomeness and safety and all these things. And they've treated my son like garbage, and I'm mad as hell. Yeah. And So I'm curious, because that's also sort of been, that narrative of liberation has been disrupted by Mary and Louise. And I'm just sort of curious what you see there.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't been tracking so closely with Mary, but Louise and I know each other and are in conversation. And it does feel like there is a kind of fracturing of what we mean by feminism, but that's happened repeatedly since we had that word. Whether we could call this another wave, I don't know. Maybe we'll look back and be like the kind of pro-motherhood female embodiment wave was the whatever we're on now, 6th wave, 7th wave. Maybe we will. And there is, for a lot of women my age and younger, there is something really refreshing about going, the fact that we have a uterus is not irrelevant, right? Let's not try and design it out, maybe, because that feels like erasure. The fact that we are physically weaker and therefore sometimes actually protection is not always paternalistic. And that the idea that kind of male sexual violence is just about violence and not about sex, right? That there's no differences in, on average, over population sociosexuality is, again, I just think really, really helpful. What's interesting is both Louise and Mary, and I've heard Louise say this personally, and Louise tells me Mary says it, both have quite high conflict tolerance, right? Mary would talk about herself as kind of like spectrumy, and Louise just really likes a good argument, right? She was a columnist, she was a kind of opinion editor. That is a particular temperament which some women have, but I would argue shows up more readily on average amongst men. And so when I'm thinking and writing about women in public, I wrote a piece called Just Call Me Token Woman, which was very like trying to tease out what's uncomfortable about being the only woman in some of these spaces, like what's just my sin, like what's my tribalism, what's my wanting everything to be according to my preferences, and also what is actually naming a thing that a lot of women feel, which is the way we do public conversations. And honestly, it's why I still he's changed and said a lot over time, but why I still find it difficult to listen to Jordan Peterson, even though there are lots of things that he says that I can read on paper and go, yeah, that makes sense. That seems wise. And I have lots of male friends who found him very, very helpful. I don't think he would respect me if he met me. Right? I don't know if he would, but the way he speaks and talks about gender, and this is a part of his tone in general, seems to be uncareful and not listening to the experiences of women. He's listening deeply to the experiences of men, and therefore is very helpful for them. And that's brilliant. And I don't want to stop that. But I find him hard to listen to because I don't feel there's no hospitality for me there. There's no welcome for me there. And for better or worse, all of us sometimes need that. And so one of the reasons something like Estuary is appealing, even though it's there's maybe more, I don't know if there's more men than women in general, but for Midwestery, is that it's premised on listening, right? It's premised on understanding. It's not premised on owning each other and telling each other that we're wrong or stupid, because I don't have that high conflict tolerance. And that might just be personality. It might be my gender, biologically or sociologically. I don't really care. I don't have a high conflict tolerance. I don't want to fight people. I want to listen to people, and I want to be listened to. There's a lot of disconnected thoughts, but that's what it made me.
I don't think it's disconnected at all. One of the interesting things. So I grew up very much within the African-American civil rights milieu. Mm-hmm. That was the church I grew up in. It was the time I grew up in. my family was very much in it. And then also in terms of the Christian Reformed Church in North America, the fight over women in ecclesiastical office, those were the defining fights that I came of age in. And, part of the conflict in terms of race is colorblindness versus recognizing, the difference. And I think, as Jordan Peterson, among many others, have noted, that actually most of the racial differences are majority cultural differences, not actually biological. But with men and women, those biological differences are clearly, much higher, because biologically, an African American man and a European man genetically are very, very close. A man and a woman, hormonally are different. And so part of what I think we're wrestling with now is, okay, embodiment. And so we both don't want to be treated as a man or as a woman. And yet we must be treated as a man and as a woman. So again, we have one of these polarities that we somehow have to manage together. And there's probably no rule that can finally govern the difference. But and you just mentioning that high tolerance for, I just thought, wow, that's now that you say it, it's like bang between both of them. It's abundantly obvious. And your instinct with respect to Jordan is interesting, because if you ever watch his conversation with Louise Perry, but actually that's the pattern with Jordan, as he kept talking over Louise Perry. She barely got a word in. I was so
But
frustrated.
he does the same thing with Jordan Hall or other male guests.
Does the same thing with Jordan Hall. Does the same thing. And for Jordan, it seems to be much more his perception of status than so part of the difficulty again is that part of what we've seen now with Christian pluralism and the pervasive pluralism and just the upping of resolution. I mean, if there's any niche idea, let's say we want to study this tolerance for conflict dynamic that we have in us, there's a spectrum. You can go on YouTube and I bet you spend days just finding videos about tolerance for conflict. And again, you'll probably find that men have higher tolerance for conflict than women, and the evolutionary biologists
someone will come in and say all of that gender science is nonsense. And
exactly.
I'm like, I don't have a gender studies degree. I don't have a human biology degree. Like, I don't know what any of these words mean, but I do know that the way my female friends experience some things are different on average. And then there are some people who are outliers, right? And that both those things are true. That there are some on average differences, and then that those categories are very complex and need to be continually complexified so that we don't end up smushing people into boxes they neither fit in nor want to fit in.
Yeah. So I really appreciate your points, Elizabeth. Like, one of the things that I feel like I notice about our Chicago estuary group is that it attracts a lot of people who feel like they didn't get to talk about what they wanted to talk about anywhere else. And that can sometimes mean that it feels like some of the people want to talk about things that are taboo in other places to talk about. Like that Love is Blind example that I gave earlier. The women on the episodes were perfectly clear about every propositional point of their politics. The men were sort of like, can we talk about this when the cameras are off, please? Because they knew that their propositional beliefs were lower status with the main audience.
The imagined audience.
But still probably, like this sense that there's a lot more risk and downside for them saying what they want to say than the women saying what they want to say. I'm not saying every space feels like that. Love is Blind, I'm sure I bet the gender metrics of the audience are about 80 or 90% female, and then the other 10% are husbands that like watching things with their wives. And then but so our space, I think, does attract a lot of guys. And I think part of that is, ideas, blabbering about
to be clear,
ideas.
I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we should be able to cluster with like-minded people and not get our knickers in a twist about it.
But I think my question is how do we deal with guys who might want to talk about things that they don't feel like they get to talk about anywhere else, that can be very masculine coded and masculine level assertive, because they feel like they need and want a place to talk about that.
Yeah.
But have that also simultaneously be a place where women are welcome.
Great question. I think so. The place I came to at the end of that piece was slightly like "Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom." The danger is when one mode becomes so normed that other ways of being, there's no hospitality for other ways of being. But again, to come back to clarity as kindness, it's why I am very pro the men being able to have male-only spaces and women being able to have women-only spaces. Like I think a kind of, but yes, some curation and some clarity about the kind of issues that everyone could feel welcome in talking. Not everyone, obviously, but that like the kind of people that you get in Estuary and all their different perspectives could come and listen to. And then when the space is getting dominated by issues that people with lower conflict tolerance, whatever gender they are, you know, people who have a personal stake in the issue, like if you're talking about sexuality, for example, or you're talking about Christianity and there's some people there who are carrying some trauma around that, whatever it is, we all have our stuff, right? We all have our wounds, we all have our sins. It may be appropriate to be like, okay, we're going to have, we really want to have people speak. We're going to do a little separate session that's focusing on this issue that you can opt into or opt out of. Like often when I'm helping people navigate difficult discussions, that's what I do. I'm like, this is highly neuralgic as an issue. We can't just bounce people into it and we can't avoid it and ignore it. So how do we curate a space that is like a strong enough container to hold it? And there is enough clarity about what we are doing here. And then everyone can consent to be part of it. So yeah, something about clarity and norms would be but I probably sound incredibly fluffy and
no, I think you're right. And I think we've always resisted wanting to just become a gendered space for men.
Yeah.
That's been brought up. I mean, that idea has certainly been floated multiple times. Are we just sort of like a men's discussion group? And should we lean into that and then enforce the gender norm? And then that has all sorts of effects and downstream consequences. And I think every time that's been brought up, it's like, no, that's not what we want. Even if there's a gender skew in the voluntary interest balance. Yeah. Although I suspect that the conferences tend to have more women than the individual meetings. Both because people might bring their spouses or significant others. And I think the conference feels a little bit different than the small groups. So I suspect that, I mean, it'll still probably be 70-30, but that's different than 90-10. Yeah. And, but Paul, you're scratching your beard.
Yeah, well, a lot depends on, part of the difficulty that John Van Donk, who sort of, birthed this thing with me, two men birthed the thing, is most of our groups that are more disconnected from my YouTube channel are much better balanced between men and women. And one of the interesting dynamics that you see, like my group at church is about 50-50, 60-40 men, because I will get tourists coming in from the channel to go to the local group just because of the channel. But it's very interesting because, physically, of course, men are stronger, newsflash. But verbally, when you get women sort of on a level playing field in a group like this, where we're going to be talking about, women win the pitch more than men. And women, John Van Donk and I have both noticed women really take strongly to estuary groups, which makes me not feel so bad about the fact that most of the groups sort of downstream from my channel, because of the particular history and polarity of YouTube itself, tend to be coded male. It's like, that's not a bad idea if there's at least this one space where men can talk and listen, and women, who anybody will tell you, especially junior high or high school, women's verbal skills, they're ahead of the men. and you get a group which is primarily verbal in terms of orientation, look out, dudes.
Yeah. Just to be clear, I have no problem with the fact that two men launched it and it's predominantly men. I think it's a beautiful thing, like healthy, seeming from the outside, like possibly morally formative community, of which we need more in the world. It's just when we're thinking, particularly what you said, Sam, about difference and disagreement and how we learn to tolerate it. It's one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot. And how do you neither do the poles of like, none of this matters, and also shut up about being a woman, which like, I'm not thinking about this most of the time, right? I'm thinking about the other themes that we were talking about, and to acknowledge that it is one of those differences that does affect how we encounter each other and the kind of spaces we curate and our ability to be hospitable to the kind of people that we want to be in conversations and relationships with.
And there needs to be a container for that hospitality. Hospitality means you're being welcomed into something, and that something has its own structure, characteristics, aspects, resources, the things that make you feel happy that you're in there. A home has walls and a fireplace and chairs and couches and lights, etc. Right? You don't like hospitality requires a strong identity in which you are being welcomed into, and it's a place that feels like a nice place to be once you're welcomed into it. And then the hospitality also needs to help make people feel like they are safe and that they belong. And I feel like that's part of what makes TLC work. And again, TLC and Estuary are similar but different, and siblings, and it's sort of IRL versus internet. But I do think that part of what makes TLC work is we have a strong history of you have to tell your story to get people to listen to you. So we have sort of an initiation ritual, which used to be just having your randos conversation on Paul's channel. Now there are sort of other places where that might happen. He's outsourced and delegated that to multiple other places, even though that still happens sometimes. And so that amount of like, I don't know, like this is a little bit of crude, like the dogs need to be able to smell your butt a little bit before we welcome you in, you know, like we need to know a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from. Show your face. You know, the internet, it can be a scary place. And if you get past that anonymous stage and we know, like, we know your story, and so then I can connect your story and where you're coming from to your face. That's a big part of, I think, what makes it worth it and why it works. But that's part of you're being welcomed into something too. There is a home-ish of sorts that is the thing that you're being welcomed into and that you can belong to. And because it's decentralized, it's hard to get kicked out unless you just get really a lot of people angry at you. And in which case, at that point, you probably deserved it. But you know, that's part of the reason why it kind of works.
Well, we're large enough now that we have our own exile spaces too, so there's room for them. I won't name names.
Ex-estuary community.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think I'll bring us to a close. Do either of you have any sort of closing thoughts or things that you want to say before we finally wrap up?
Just thanks for a lovely conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
I'm super excited for the event, and I love it that one of my favorite conversations that Elizabeth has had was her one with Rod Dreher, and Rod will be at the event. And Rod is one of these guys who, again, I read him 4 or 5 days a week, and I've read him for years. And it's, you know, one side of Rod comes through with his writing, but in person, this other side of Rod comes, and I'm really excited about the mix that we're going to have at this event. And not just, I don't know how the planners are managing the size, because a lot of our estuary events, you know, they're smaller, and so we can have less stage priority and more, you know, small circle priority.
Yeah.
But I'm super excited for the mix that we have, and I think I'm very, very excited for this event. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. Just to answer that question and to get people excited, there will be a chance to participate in estuary groups at the event. And we hope to have those to be around 10 or a dozen-ish people. And the church building that we're meeting at has a lot of breakout rooms, like middle school rooms, youth group rooms, like those sorts of things that will enable there to be private space. And we have that time built into the agenda so that you'll have sort of this small group. So if you so choose, you don't need to join the estuary groups. That's part of the registration process. You signal if you want that or if you don't. But if you do, then you're part of the same group throughout the whole conference. You meet a handful of times. You'll get to talk about your reflections to the speakers and stuff like that. And then there's a social and sort of after hours time where you can hang out with them or whoever else. And so we hope people, our hospitality is warm and welcoming, and we hope that lots of people feel like they're belonging and that they're safe and that they have something interesting to say and people who want to listen to what they have to say too.
And we're never safe when we're with other people, but we can be welcome.
Fair enough. Safe enough.
Yeah. I think the word safe, it's, I don't know, I have a bit of an allergy to it.
Fair enough.
Life is not safe.
Well, Paul and Elizabeth, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you in August. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.